Hello, everyone, and welcome to Critical Faculty, the new edition. Hopefully, you enjoyed the new 2023 intro.
That's a
How are you,
super
Jonathan?
super sexy intro if ever I've seen one.
I'll tell you all about them later on. But thank you for being my very first guest in 2023, finishing up your fantastic book.
Thank you. I am honoured to be here to finish up our book series of 30 arguments against the existence of God, heaven, hell, Satan, and divine design. So thanks for that.
Thanks very much, Jonathan. I've been watching closely before we get into the subject, but I want to quickly. I mean, the description of your channel is in the description of this video here. But now you've got a second channel because the demand on the contents you've been creating covering the Ukraine war, not just politically, but you've touched on philosophical aspects, value aspects. It's way too more complex than what meets the eye.
Yeah, and also the psychology of how people deal with information, a bit like what we talk about here, which is things like confirmation bias. So when you're looking at sources, like why is it that, and then you have pro-Russians and pro-Ukrainians, like, okay, morally, what's going on there? And then when we're looking at sources, how are we evaluating them? What we bring in, what baggage are we bringing to the table to look at them, to build our conclusions? So actually, the philosophy has a lot to answer for in terms of how we approach any subject in the world, and Ukraine is just such a subject, and I'm obsessed with the geopolitical situation there. So I've created a sub channel, ATP, Atypical Philosopher, Geopolitics. So yeah, that's where I've spent a lot of time recently, but still trying to balance both, like the philosophy side of things at my core channel of Atypical Philosopher as well.
Yeah, I'm going to link them quite nicely with the very next topic we're going to be talking about, because some would believe that we are our most honest when we are very primal. And sex, food, survival, killing somebody else, struggling for life. These are very primal emotions, and we become very, very honest. Obviously, when you are taking part of it, but from the outside, you fall into all these biases. But those who are participating in the act of war, there is no time to act or pretend. It's you're raw. It's raw human stuff.
Let's do a bit of connections here, actually. So that's a nice little sort of almost segue, I guess. But I often defend religious people when I hear, I mean, my own mother said this, oh, religion starts all the wars. Religion is a cause of all wars. I'm like, yeah, it's easy to say that. But actually, when you look at it, that's really not the case. What goes on is humans start wars for very human reasons. Well, you could say religion is one of those. But actually, what we tend to do is post-hoc rationalize a kind of religiosity over that. But really, it's kind of in-group, out-group psychology often. It's fighting over resources. These guys are a different religion. We're going to fight them over religious reasons, but actually we want their land, we want the power, we want their resources. They've got things that we want, we've got things that they want. And so, you look at Northern Ireland, and yes, you do have a historical kind of religious aspect to that, where you've got Protestants and Catholics, but then they're not really fighting each other because of theological content, right? They're fighting each other because this is our group, and we identify ourselves by Protestant, and that's your group, and you identify yourself as Catholics, and that's part of our identity, and we are fighting over identity here, really. We're not fighting because you believe in transubstantiation. We are fighting because we're different groups of humans, and this is what we do. As you say, it's quite natural for humans to develop those in-group, out-group psychologies, and then politics gets involved. And so I wouldn't say that is a religious war, but it has a religious component, but it's actually not probably what drives it at the core psychological level.
Completely agree. I said Billy Joel once said we didn't start the fire; it was always burning. So this sort of thing, it's within the human nature, but it takes a mask of either a religious war or nationalistic war. But they come from the one same source: my group, your group. But one thing here that's going to connect the two is some would believe that if you die for the right cause, and by surrendering your critical faculties, as Christopher Hitchens once said, you for the very, very humble reward of eternal life in heaven.
Well, I presume that's very much an Islamic understanding, perhaps, but there will be elements of that in Christianity, for example, as well, and religions where you think, actually, if I die and I'm doing a moral good and I'm really, dying as some kind of hero, martyr, or at least some moral agent that is going to be judged to be doing the right thing, then I'm assuring myself a place in heaven, and that is, often a driver. It's a really powerful. I mean, heaven and we'll obviously talk at huge depth about this, but heaven and hell are the biggest conceptual bribes that humans can possibly have. Right. So you've got heaven is like the greatest thing your mind can imagine. If you can imagine something greater than that, then that will become heaven. Right. So there is nothing greater than your mind can imagine. There's nothing worse than hell. Like whatever the worst thing you can imagine, that's generally what people's idea of hell is. There are annihilationists who believe that you just stop existing after you die. But assuming a traditional understanding of hell, then these are really powerful motivators to get you. And this is often what keeps people locked into a belief system. So it's not like, I'm going to do this. I'm going to go to war because of this. Or I'm going to. I just literally. I'm going to stay in this. I have these doubts about Christianity. I have these doubts about Islam. But hey, if I stop believing, what if I don't get to go to heaven? And if I make the wrong choice, what if I go to hell? And that keeps you locked in. You speak to a lot of former believers, and the big thing that locks them in, and other people they know, is the heaven hell belief.
Yeah, and it leads me to a very interesting conversation I was having on Clubhouse the other day, where God is being used as a bridge. Sometimes I feel like some faithful don't really care about God that much. They just care about going to heaven and avoid suffering, and therefore God is nothing but a bridge to get to there. And they will do the Pascalian wager, and will do anything to get there.
I 100% agree. In fact, I've recently been saying that, and people might disagree with this, but I think the main component of the part of the reason why Islam and Christianity are such huge religions is because they promise the afterlife. Judaism, yeah, it has quite a difficult barriers to entry for getting into that, but actually it's a very small religion. If you look at the adherents worldwide, and they don't really have the same kind of heaven hell concepts as, say, Christianity and Islam. People love those ideas, or they feel they need those ideas. They have functional benefit for people's kind of happiness or sense of meaning, so on and so forth. It doesn't have to be that way, but it is for a lot of people. And so I think that religion's success is based on, all these big religions' successes are based on the belief in the afterlife. And if you didn't have the afterlife component to Christianity, for example, or Islam, they wouldn't be as successful, and wouldn't have as many adherents as they do. I absolutely agree. And I think, if you think about, what is motivating people, like they want to believe. Yeah, why do you want to believe? Why do you believe in Jesus? Why do you believe in God? Yeah, but why? And it's like, so I go to heaven. Right. Okay. So that's really what's driving the behavior. If we keep asking the why question, yeah, we get down to some non-derivative. You can't derive it further, like axiom, which is like, yeah, heaven and I want to avoid hell.
Because when you think of it, if God really exists, that should be the ultimate reward. Being in that relationship and being aware the presence of God, that should be enough. But if you go, and by the way, I'm believing because, then suddenly God becomes that bridge.
Yeah, and also they get that union with God, that presence of God for eternity. So there is that, and they can dress it up as like, yeah, but it is because of God, because I get to spend all that time with God. We have this personal relationship for eternity. And but yeah, it's just obviously the best thing, whatever the best thing is, you get that for eternity. Well, of course that's cool. I mean, this is a challenge for atheists, right? And for atheism is that when Hitler goes and does the terrible stuff, Godwin's law, I've already mentioned Hitler, but when Hitler goes and does all that terrible stuff, or Putin or Pol Pot or whatever, the atheist has to go, oh, damn, shit happens. The world, the universe is unfair. And, when that baby dies at 6 months old from some kind of cancer that it's got, then you're like, damn, life is really crappy sometimes. Whereas the Christian or the Muslim can go, it's okay, that baby will be fine in heaven. And it's okay. All those people killed in the Holocaust, they'll go to heaven, and Hitler will go to hell forever. And that's kind of wraps everything up in a nice, neat bow, package it off. There you go. all the terrible things in the world sorted, or all the wonderful things in the world sorted because you're rewarded for that. Brilliant. Life is superb. So I think heaven and hell as a concept, as a pair of concepts, are based on the human proclivity for adhering to the just world theory, which is that, do you know what? I just have this sense of fairness, and the universe is a just world. We live in a just world, and it might seem really unfair right now, but eventually it will be fair. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Oh, completely. And I'm completely in a complete agreement as well. Christopher Hitchens was once asked, I said, okay, well, I can understand creating heaven. We all want to be in a better position later on, but why hell? And he answered, oh, that's simple. That's for other people to go
That's for
to.
other people. Yeah.
Anybody else other than us, So it's with that feeling that you want to be rewarded forever, but those who sort of done you wrong, or those who have got a monobrow that you hate very much, they're going to end up in heaven.
But this is it. So we're very good. We're very good at judging other people, and then not so good at judging ourselves, or at least when we judge ourselves, it's like, well, yeah, I believe in the right Christianity, so I'm going to heaven, and I'm whatever I do, I'll post up rationalize as being that which God wants. And if I do slightly err, then forgiveness, like the classic get out of jail free card. It's fine, God will forgive me, I'll go to heaven anyway. So it's like I'm assured heaven, and yeah, I'll maybe constrain my behavior somewhat to align with what I believe. There'll be some kind of ebbing and flowing, maybe a little bit there, but yeah, I'm going to heaven. These guys, they're in trouble. And the issue is that if you really believe in this terrible version of hell, and again, there is a spectrum of beliefs in hell, but if you believe in the eternal conscious torment, ECT, if you believe in ECT, then you can understand why people go and witness. Because actually, if you really entertain the idea that maybe some of your own family members are going to be eternally consciously tormented, like that's forever. That's a really long time. Then you can understand people getting out on the street corners and saying, I don't want you to go through that, so I am going to save you. Like that is a moral position to take. And so, yeah, like it's a horrible, weird thing to do. In Britain, we don't really have these kind of street witnesses and whatnot, but I do understand the concept.
Oh yeah, I would. That's why I'm not very harsh with these other people, because I think they come from an okay place. I don't think they're people call them bashers and all sort of horrible things. But if you are in their position, you would understand why would they trying to save you. I don't think they are horrible, just wrong. That's all, and that's the conversation I'd be having with them. But with the heaven, I mean, with that concept, it makes religion so powerful because you and I would probably turn up to a funeral. And there will be very little to say to a mother who's just lost her child. I'll still don't have the words for him. Maybe one day we will develop the right vocabulary, but as of now, there's nothing more consoling than heaven.
That's a really good point. And you can't turn around and say, "Oh, yeah, little Jimmy's going to be worm food." That's nice, isn't it? But actually, there is a way. So recently, one of my friends died, and his sister. Well, actually, his sister's my friend, but he's a friend as well. And I put on Facebook just a kind of eulogy to him, and I found that actually there is some, like, I don't believe in God. She doesn't believe in God. So I was putting, he was as good a human. The universe just isn't fair. Like, good people don't get to last. But he, in some sense, he's quite a sci-fi geek. So I made some sci-fi references and saying, he has become, perhaps at some point, he will become stardust, and from him, other life will emerge, type thing. You can dress it up poetically, and there is a nice way of kind of, you play around with words, and I generally feel that as well. It's like I'm not just saying stuff I don't believe, but so there is a nice way that you can maybe couch things. But at the end of the day, yeah, he's dead. And he ain't coming back in the form of who he is, in his identity. So at some point, we've got to get over the issue that atheism ain't going to promise you very much past, the death part. And that's a tough gig. It's a tough sell that to people. This is why religious people had that kind of advantage of being able to kind of emotionally blackmail people. But of course, it says nothing about the truth of these claims. And it also says nothing about whether these claims are in any sense coherent, because they're not.
Maybe I'm weird, but I've never understood the obsession of wanting to live forever.
There is a philosophical problem, the philosophical boredom. There are arguments to suggest that heaven is a real, it has a really, really problematic aspect to it, because actually, if you live forever, you will have experienced pretty, people don't understand infinity, right? People don't even understand a billion. Okay, well, if you were to earn $5,000 a year from 1492 to $5,000 a day, is it, from 1492 to now? You still wouldn't have $1 billion, and you still would have earned less than Jeff Bezos does in a week, type thing. People don't understand how big $1 billion is, right? $1 billion is an infinitesimal fraction compared to infinity, so it's as if nothing. So whatever the biggest number you can think of, times that by itself, like itself number of times to the power of itself, like whatever. So infinity is obviously astronomically huge. It never ends as a number. So if you're living that long, there's a real strong argument to say that would be horrible and there would actually be torment. So what you'd have to kind of start envisaging, I would posit, is that you'd have to have your self reinventing itself every so often, like forgetting everything and starting again to get the joy of learning once you've learned everything. Do you know what I mean? So
yeah.
But then you get these weird scenarios where, well, I'm not me anymore because I'm a reinvented me and I'm a new me. And so is that me in heaven all the time, or is this me 2.0 type? Anyway, all these.
But the urgency or the will to do anything in our daily basis is based on I've got to do this by next week, otherwise I'm going to miss out on that. But if you've got eternity, why would you be motivated to do anything? You've got plenty of time. And with the Infinite Regress by William Lane Craig, where it leads to absurdity going back, so you'll never come to today, wouldn't infinity then mathematically apply to the future? Because if the future is infinite, then you shouldn't be able to come to tomorrow, because it's both ways.
Yeah, I mean, when we start arguing about infinity, things get a bit funky.
It's crazy.
And there are some people who would claim that real infinity and set theory can exist. Others that it can't. You can use it mathematically. Is it a real thing? So on and so forth. I mean, I discuss a lot of these concepts in my book, Did God Create the Universe from Nothing? Countering William Lane Craig's Kalam cosmological argument, which is kind of what you're referring to there. And I've got a mathematician in there, Dr. James East, who writes a chapter on infinity, actually, in Hilbert's Hotel and all these ideas. So
all the paradoxes. Yeah, it's very paradoxical, infinity.
Yeah, and so the idea, you are going to be living for a very, very long time. But I think, going back to how these ideas developed, I think it's this just world theory. So back in the intertestamental period between the kind of two testaments, you started seeing a development in Jewish thinking towards a kind of afterlife. It was originally annihilationism. Now, there's an interesting thing here that if heaven and hell is all it's about, like if you ask Christians now and say, what's existence about, they'll tell you it's about heaven and avoiding hell. Like that's your end game, right? If that's the really important end game, why is there no mention of heaven and hell in the Torah, in the Tanakh, effectively, the Hebrew Bible? It doesn't appear. Well, if that's the big end game, it's kind of weird that it just gets developed like right at the end of that and towards the Christian period. So
and so is Lucifer, because they're kind of connected, because Lucifer wasn't.
And that's weird. I think in the previous episode we talked about how Satan is God's middle manager anyway, because anything that Satan does, God is admissively willing to happen. Like God could kill Satan like that, right? So the fact that Satan still exists, as according to people who believe he exists, is on the will of God. So anything that Satan does is because God allows him to do that, which means that God wants him to do that and doesn't stop him from doing it. So therefore, Satan is just a tool of God. So anything you blame Satan on should be aimed directly at God. But that's something we said previously. But the idea is that I think you had this time when you had the Seleucid Empire, which was Jews that were being oppressed by other Jews who are Hellenized Jews, like Greekized Jews. And they were like, hang on, these guys, we're the good guys, we're the promised people, we're the chosen people. This is our promised land. How come all the crap's happening to us, and how come all the good stuff's happening to these bad guys? So they were like, well, if we all get annihilated, we die, when we die, we die. How can we, like, this is unfair. Like, if God's supposed to be, a-okay, then this sucks. So then they kind of looked at the Greek ideas of Tartarus and Elysian fields and all this, and they're like, oh, okay, there might be something in this, and the eternal life through the soul. We talked a little bit about the soul before. I could do a two-hour video on the soul. The soul is completely incoherent as an idea, but like as a vehicle, you need something like that to get you to the afterlife. So then you saw the development of these ideas of heaven and hell that came out from that period. But when you start understanding the kind of anthropological development of these concepts, you kind of like, well, are they really true? I mean, we can see why they developed functionally, like to make sense of the world, but actually there was no kind of direct revelation of these, really. There's no detail on them as well, so they're suitably vague. When you see heaven and hell mentioned in the New Testament, like, people disagree on exactly what it means, and they're suitably vague, and that's a good thing for Christianity, because if they actually nailed the colors to the mast and gave you details on heaven and hell, guaranteed they would have been disproven by philosophers thousands of years later. So to give you a vague account at the beginning and say, yeah, heaven and hell, and then everyone can go with it and adapt their model to whatever might fit, you know.
Yeah, well, Islam made that huge mistake of actually describing paradise in a very naive way. They're talking about rivers of milk that never changes its taste, alcohol that doesn't get you drunk, grapes, all sort of fruits. But then they say at the very end, but it's not like the groups you have on Earth. This is the composition problem, because nothing can ever be imagined outside of experience. Even a dragon is made of bits and pieces of things that we know exist. You know, here's a horse, put a horn on it, it's a unicorn. Here's, you know, it's these sort of mix and match type of ideas. But even God himself looks like he's unable to come up with something outside of our own realm.
Yeah, I mean, it's so difficult to imagine something you've never imagined, or imagine something you've never had any kind of experience of, the components. We make things of like hybrids of things. New ideas are kind of hybrids of other things, but actually to imagine something that's completely like out of your realm of conceptualization is a funky idea to play around with. But yeah, so, you know, the idea in your case of is Islamic heaven would be the things that were really relevant to the people at the time, like milk and alcohol, but it doesn't get you drunk. All these kind of things. Like, let's imagine this, and what would be the cool version of this? That. Okay, that's what heaven is. Brilliant. And that's kind of what we do with heaven, which is like, what's the coolest thing I can imagine? You know, and there's this argument in Islam that 72 virgins, but then there's the argument that that's a mistranslation. It actually means, you know, grapes and
raisins. Raisins.
Yeah.
Imagine being torn to pieces and just be handed over the gates of here's your plate of 72 raisins.
I'm here for the virgins. No, did you get? Well, you got the wrong memo. It's raisins. Here you go. Are you serious? Oh,
also, the situation about the alcohol in the milk. It seems like it's a prophecy of the first Kahlua drink.
Right? Yeah. This is it.
It's a nice soothing just before bedtime.
Yeah, it doesn't get you drunk, but yeah. So that's the idea of heaven and hell. So really, we get on to the argument. I mean, the first we've been had as a nice bit of preamble, 25-minute preamble. I love it. So we get on to the argument. What's the point of heaven and hell? You know, really, what's the point? Yeah, it's lovely, but when we look at Earth, we look at, say, prison, and we see the most effective prisons are transformative prisons. So you might go to Norway and look at some more authoritarians and say, oh, those liberal prisons, they're rubbish. You know, actually, you look at the recidivism rates, right? They've got the lowest recidivism rates in the world, which means that people won't reoffend. So something like less than 30% reoffending rates. Well, that's brilliant. It's going to save you loads of money on not having to put up prisoners for ever and a day. What you do is you look after them humanely, you give them the tools to equip themselves to succeed in life, and then you rehabilitate them. And then when you're assured they're rehabilitated, you send them out on their way, and then they are reintroduced into society having been transformed. Now, the worst prisons are the ones where you just punish them ad infinitum and just keep them there. Like, what's the point? Well, it's retribution. So that's all about retribution. So the idea of heaven and hell, I would argue is that it depends entirely on libertarian free will, and we've already talked about how philosophically that's a really problematic concept. In fact, incoherent. But you need libertarian free will to have heaven and hell, because if you're always going to do what you're going to do in the situation you're in, then it seems rather unfair that you then get punished with heaven or hell, or rewarded with heaven on account of you just fulfilling your causal circumstance. So it needs libertarian free will. So that's a problem. You don't have libertarian free will, you don't get heaven and hell, right? I would argue, I know Calvinists believe there is heaven and hell, and they also don't believe in free will, but I think their whole system just makes God look like a complete bastard. So you need free will, but then it's like, well, what's the point of punishing someone forever? Like, and especially if God knows that in advance. So God sees Hanny, right? And he says, Hanny, I know before I create you, I know that you are going to be just a bit of a bastard, right? And you're going to do all the wrong things. And I know exactly why you're going to choose all the wrong things. And I know that you're going to choose all the wrong things. And I know that you're going to go to hell, right? But I'm going to create you anyway. And you have no choice in the matter. You haven't even been created yet. And you're like, hang on, I've been designed and created, thrown onto this world, and you already know I'm going to go to hell. How is that fair? So if God has divine foreknowledge, God just appears, again, completely morally abhorrent to design and create the vast majority of humans, apparently, to go to hell. And he knows that that's going to happen. And then they stay there for eternity, if you believe in ECT. So if they stay there for eternity, then what is the point of that? He's designed, created these people such that they go to hell, throw them into hell, locks them up, throws away the key, and it's like, yeah, done. So what are you doing? Like, what's the point of this? Do you know what I mean? Like, I just find it morally absolutely abhorrent.
I completely agree. And while we're chatting, this is an Arabic comment that says, fuck you guys, you're infidels. In Arabic.
But yeah, and you're quite right. We are. But the point is, well, what do you do with that? So if God knows that we're infidels, God created the world such that we would become infidels, because with divine foreknowledge, God would know we would become infidels, created the world in such a way that it encouraged us to be this way, or that we ended up being this way, then sentences us to eternity in hell. Why do that? So you can say that to us, fair enough, but you need to justify why your God would do what you think your God would do.
Absolutely. I mean, the faithful always struggle with saying, well, are you saying the world was created from chaos and everything's arbitrary? No, hold on a second. Everything has a plan. But then when you try to explain this, and you say God has full knowledge, he's going to create human beings, sentient beings, probably 120 billion so far, ever since sort of civilization started and counting, and very, very small percentage of these will actually end up going to heaven. God is going to be on a throne of whinging, crying, screaming people for eternity, and he knows that. Let that sink in. I mean, it's just bizarre.
It is horrific, and just God is a moral monster if you believe in hell. And if I was to be a believer, any kind of theistic believer, I wouldn't be able to believe in a God and an afterlife. Either I wouldn't believe in an afterlife, in which case I'd have a very different idea of God. But if I did believe in an afterlife, I would have to be a universalist. There's no way, if God has divine foreknowledge, there's no way you can get God morally off the hook unless everyone gets saved. If everyone gets saved, that's fair enough. And so actually I do have some sympathy for Christians who are universalists. I don't think it fits very well theologically with what we see in the Bible necessarily, but philosophically speaking, that's the only way of making God look vaguely nice.
Yeah, it's incoherent. So, I mean, this heaven and hell business is going to be very difficult to have a conversation with the faithful, because that's exactly what they want out of this game here. And what else would you say to them? I mean, if somebody's got that sort of belief, but and it varies. Some have that sort of Viking type of mentality that you got to be killed in battle to earn heaven, and that's the harsh one, because they'll actually do stuff on Earth to harm people to get there. And some would actually have that spiritualistic feel, like, if I just do the right thing, help the poor, and I don't mind that sort of thing, because at the end of the day, even though uh, I don't think what they believe in is true, but the reflection of that on the ground is probably going to be end up being some nice things, helping the poor, so that's why I don't interfere. But when it actually interferes with your behavior and leads you to do things on this earth to people, like killing the apostates. If you leave your religion, you got to be killed, and it makes you wonder, why would these things be imposed on earth if there is an eternal judgment and is a final ultimate judgment by the biggest judge of them all? Why there are people still are ordered to do certain things to people on this earth?
Yeah, so two big sort of different areas there. First one is like, what would you say to certain people? There is a real issue, and this stretches outside of debates over heaven and hell, but it's defined by ideas of heaven and hell, which is if you're arguing with, I don't know, a young earth creationist, right? And you say, oh yeah, here's all the evidence. I'm going to present you, here's a bunch of evidence that the world is more than 6,000 years old, right? And you give them all this rational evidence. The fact is that they will be unable to evaluate that particularly rationally, because at the back of their minds they will have this idea. I mean, it's all wrapped up in ideas of mortality salience and terror management theory. So if anyone wants to go and look up terror management theory, so it's the idea of like the way we manage our terror of existential crisis of dying is to invent things like heaven and hell. But if I'm going to challenge you on the age of the earth, what I'm doing is I'm saying, yeah, your belief that involves the earth being 6,000 years old. Well, it also involves you going to heaven for eternity. So if I disabuse you of this notion that the world is 6,000 years old, I'm also invalidating your access to heaven. So they go, right, what you may be saying here might be right, but the cognitive dissonance of what that entails in my head and these ideas and there's disharmony in my head and the idea I'm not going to go to heaven is too much for me, so I can't deal with that. So therefore, when I'm coming to you with evidence for evolution and geology, that will get rejected, but not on the basis of the quality of that evidence. It'll be rejected on the basis that it's threatening your eternal life.
Yeah, it's not that their stance was based on evidence to start with. It's appeal to emotion. So whatever evidence you're going to be produce is going to be falsified in terms of, oh well, there's a worldwide conspiracy, and the Freemasons and all these weird things, the Illuminatis, and if you're a conspiracy theorist, then there is nothing I can do. As a matter of fact, you will be part of the conspiracy.
Yeah, and especially when those bribes, those twin bribes of heaven and hell, are that strong, right? Then it is really difficult to overcome that. So what you have to do is show. I mean, my attempt here is to show that heaven and hell as ideas are just incoherent. Right, you can believe in heaven and hell, but let's have a look at what your beliefs are. So it's like challenging your friend here who wrote in Arabic. Okay, fair enough. Right. Okay. Set out what you believe, and let's see if that is coherent. Let's see if those things work, and if they don't work, you can bury your head in the sand. But I can tell you're not rationally justified in holding your position. So that's my intent here.
Probably finish this one point on, maybe you want to move to another point, but on the Pascal's wager situation, where some would actually believe that, we really want heaven. Let's just fool this God into, let's just pretend, or let's just appear to be believing just in case. And because they really don't care about the integrity of the belief, and they don't even understand that beliefs are involuntary. You can't actually choose what you believe. But deceiving yourself, the term is very famous, fake it till you make it sort of thing. You fake it until you actually believe, or you sing hallelujah in the church along with everybody, hold hands and feel the music and everything, pretend. And maybe God is just, there's so many of us, he's not paying attention to everyone. That might just be.
You actually talk about a quite big philosophical idea called doxastic voluntarism. So yes. Doxastic voluntarism is this idea that you can't choose to believe something, right? So if I said to you, Hanny, right, can you, the moon is made of cheese, like, you go on, believe that the moon is made of cheese. You can't just go, all right, I now believe the moon is made of cheese. What happens is you have an involuntary belief in something based on a certain threshold being reached on whatever that proposition is. So if you were given like tons and tons of evidence over like 20-year period and everyone came together on the moon is made of cheese, then you might get to a point where you go, okay, I believe the moon is made of cheese. But you don't choose to believe anything. Like, you don't wake up one day and say, I'm going to believe this now. You get to a point where you've got enough evidence to justify believing that, and then you believe in it. And it's kind of, so this is doxastic involuntarism. So the idea that you can just suddenly choose to believe in God, and that's like some free will choice, is again, it's not really understanding how volition works and how beliefs work. Like, you believe something based on a whole load of causal circumstances in your life and a whole load of previous like experiences, but it's not like a pat on the back for believing that. You've just ended up in this place where all this stuff is hitting you, and your brain is such a way that it goes, yeah, I believe that now. In the same way that I believe that, you know, the universe is infinite or not, or whatever, but I believe that based on a bunch of information on my background knowledge and everything in my prior learning, and then I go, yeah, I think I believe that. But would I put my mortgage on it? Maybe not. Maybe I do, you know. But when you come to believing in God, it's the same thing, right? You are a product of your entire causal circumstance in your environment, and you don't go, oh, now I'm going to believe. Well done, me. I deserve to go to heaven.
Yeah,
it's not
it reminds me a little bit of the life coaching situation where people are trying to get you in a group and trying to explain to you, you can intend and plan to be happy, and people will say, oh, that's wonderful, and they tell you about the things you do, and you feel that you're happy, but you go to Starbucks and you will have a breakdown when they get your order wrong. You know, suddenly all that happiness and all the positive energy that we were felt, it gets crashed by just being alive, which is basically it's an ups and downs of things that you can't control. And you know what? It actually makes life interesting that way.
Yeah, I've been hoodwinked. It turns out my life really is crap. Yeah. So the idea of this heaven and hell I was talking about before is based on ideas of retribution being like sound. I don't think they are sound, especially if you negate libertarian free will from existing. So deterrence is another idea that we have for punishment, but actually, when you look at the statistics, harsher punishment does not predict better behavior. So if you get, it turns out deterrence has a very minimal effect on behavior. It turns out that harsh punishment has a very minimal deterrent effect on behavior. And in fact, what affects behavior more is the chances of being caught. So if your town is surrounded, you know, just infested with policemen, I don't mean infested, that's the wrong word, but if they're just policemen everywhere, you won't, you know, if I go into a shop and say, right, I might shoplift this loaf of bread, if there's a 99.9% chance of me being caught, then I'm not going to shoplift that. The best predictor of behavior, or the best, you know, determiner of behavior is, in this case, you know, not chances of being caught, chance of being found out.
So a CCTV camera will do the trick.
Yeah, and all those. So again, it's like, what is the point of heaven? What is the point of hell? Are they transformative? No, they're not transformative. Heaven, you're just like, yeah, awesome stuff forever. Hell, horrible stuff forever. If that's your idea of heaven and hell, and there isn't a chance of getting out of hell, if you don't get some kind of transform to be able to access heaven, then hell is just morally abhorrent.
Yeah, even that on the deterrence situation, imagine there's a country where it says if a little kid is caught shoplifting chewing gum, you will be decapitated on the spot and brought to life over and over again, so we can keep killing you. That will stop you from stealing chewing gum.
But the problem is, so we have this kind of we're invincible. We have an invincibility bias, so we never think we're going to get caught. So even when it does come down to situations like you know, there is an actual objective, really high chance of you getting caught, you always think you're going to be in the like 0.1% of people not getting caught. So, you know, psychology.
The Dunning-Kruger effects will kick in.
Yeah. I'm always legendary. Everyone else is a loser. Which actually in this case is true. So the next argument is a case of, obviously joking, I'm not that. So, so a God, and this is in terms of judging people for heaven and hell. So God cannot be perfectly or infinitely merciful and infinitely or perfectly just. So these are common kind of arguments, so little arguments. They're not like complete winners, but they're just interesting to throw in there. So you get people that say, oh, God is infinitely just, or God is infinitely merciful. And you think, really? Like, what does that look like? Because my understanding of just, I would define this to mean acting or being in conformity with that which is merited or deserved. So you get what you deserve, right? On the other hand, merciful means acting with forbearance shown, especially to an offender or to someone subject to one's power, acting leniently or compassionately, which means that you don't get what you deserve, right? So you can't be perfectly just and perfectly merciful. Those two are just opposites almost. So when you have all these labels thrown at God, this is just word salad, almost always word salad. God is love. If God is love, right, God is infinite love. God is overflowing with so much love that he's created the universe. Okay, if that's the case, right, explain why he's created Hani Selim knowingly in advance before creating him, designed him, created him, and he knows he's going to go to hell for eternity to be punished in eternal conscious torment. Tell me how that is infinite love. Like that is there is no way you get from that scenario. Sorry, Hanny, I don't think you're really going to go to hell. but there's no way that is love. It just isn't.
Yeah, even Jordan Peterson will be able to spin doctor that.
Don't get me started.
It depends what you mean by justice. That's what he would say.
Yeah. All the classic sort of philosophers answer that, isn't it? Well, it depends what you mean by all the words you just said. Dan Barker talks. I mean, he wrote the foreword to my book. He's a legend, a lovely guy, Dan Barker. In fact, we talked together on the show.
Yes, a conversation.
Yeah, so he wrote a book, Godless, which is brilliant. Everyone should go and get that book. Get my book first. And he said, if God is infinitely merciful, he can never be just. If God is ever just, not to mention infinitely just, then he cannot be infinitely merciful. A God who is both infinitely merciful and just not only does not exist, he cannot exist. This is one of the positive arguments for the non-existence of God based on incompatible properties or incoherency. If God is defined as a married bachelor, we don't need to discuss evidence or argument. We can simply claim a logical impossibility. In response, so he then used this in debate with an Islamic scholar who chided him for failing to think in multiple dimensions at the same time. So said Rajabali, the Muslim, said, when Quran says God is merciful and God is just, he went on, these simultaneous characteristics cannot be compartmentalized. We just understand them holistically. And that was his answer, like as if that explains it. Oh, that's all right then. It's just like, okay, brilliant. That's fine. You've really explained that well. Nice one. And this is what happens is like, oh, they're optimal or they're this. And yeah, but what is that? Well, what's the point in saying these?
So the married bachelor exists after all.
Yeah. It's like just a holistic married bachelor. If you understand that holistically, then that's fine. Okay, brilliant. I'll go with that then. Thanks for that. So that anyway, there are lots of things. I mean, some people try and say, can God, create a stone too heavy for him to lift? And, there are these logical things that and then I'm never really convinced by those. I stay clear of them to say, okay, what is logically permissible? But in terms of, if you're saying this is a definition of this word and that's a definition of that word, and you apply both of those to God in infinite quantities, then I'm sorry, you got a problem there.
Yeah, so completely agree.
So we get to the next argument, which is weighing our hearts, heaven or hell, which is the idea of like, okay, what gets us into heaven and hell? So to start this off, let's have with your knowledge of Islam, what gets someone in Islamic theology, and there might be a spectrum of beliefs here, but what gets someone into heaven?
Well, theologically, very similar to Christianity. Everything can be forgiven, but not believing in God. The belief of God and of Allah is the most important aspects. As a matter of fact, you could be a fornicator, a killer, a thief, and everything else, but if you come to accept Allah and tell the Shahada, there is no God but Allah and Muhammad is his prophet, that's it. That's enough. And I think
Imagine
Christianity sort of plays with the same thing.
you've got this
Deathbed.
you got this wonderful charitable human that's devoted their entire life to just being lovely to every other human being, but doesn't believe in God. And it's like, yeah, you hell. But Hitler, you believed in God on your deathbed or whatever. I'm making that up. It's like, yeah, welcome in. You come into heaven. That's fine. You're like, really? That's yeah. So this chapter deals with these kind of ideas, and you do get. I mean, this is a big problem in Christian theology, and it's not been resolved. Which is it about faith? Which is what you were saying there. You were going down the faith route there, which is, yeah, okay. But then what about those people who were born in times and places where they had no access to the right God? Someone in an Amazonian tribe, an Amazonian forest born 5,000 years ago, had no chance of knowing Judeo, Christianity, Islam, whatever. So what do you do with them? So it can't just be if the Christian believer, in this case Christian, or if the theistic believer says, yeah, they will get to heaven still, well, then faith isn't important. Okay, so like, what goes on here? So you get some people saying, yeah, this is a bit of an issue. So someone like William Lane Craig, and we talked about this before, would say, well, those people were always going to reject God. Their souls were going to reject God. So God front loaded their souls into times and places where they couldn't access God's love. Yeah. And isn't that lucky?
So let's kill baby Hitler type of scenario, because he's going to end up being an asshole anyway.
Well, but this is slightly different, which is like, I know, and again, free will and stuff like this, but God says, I know that these people were going to reject me. So because I knew that, well, my initial response would be, well, don't create them. Like, if you know they're going to reject you, don't create them, because you're creating them so that they go to hell. But but the weird thing is, like, this answer from someone like William Lane Craig is like, so God then front loads all those people into Amazonian tribes people, or into being born in Riyadh because they won't be a Christian, in the 1950s or whenever. Okay, all these people, he knew that they were going to reject him, so he puts them in places where they can't even access his love. Or the correct version of his love, and then they end up going to hell. It's like, well, yeah, that looks horrible. But if you're the Christian believer or the theistic believer who thinks that people can go to heaven, so the Pope even mentioned this recently, sort of intimated that atheists could go to hell, heaven, which was really controversial, but actually it kind of makes a bit of sense of like, so this is faith against works or deeds, right? So is it the works or deeds that get you into heaven, or is it faith? But the problem is, if it's just one to the exclusion of the other, you get really problematic scenarios. So the faith one I talked about, like, you can be a lovely human being and do all the right things and be far nicer and better and more constructive than a believer and not get to heaven. And you can even you can be born in places and times that don't even have the chance to access God and not get to heaven. That's unfair. But then if it's just works and deeds, then what's the point in believing in God? If you can just be a nice person and get to heaven, then you don't need to believe in God. Which then renders the whole point of like trying to convince people to believe in God pointless. Just convince them to do nice things. That's much easier. But so you get this tension here, and it seems that the only way around that is to have some kind of weird hybrid version of both. Whereas like, God favors you if you do believe, but he also really wants you to do nice things. So if you do like an optimal version of that, then you get into heaven. Holistically. If you're just a holistic faith deeds person, then that's it. La, 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 la. Yeah. So, so there's a real tension there that I think hasn't been resolved, and possibly because it's unresolvable, because heaven and hell are just incoherent anyway. And you get this idea. Part of the problem is you've got this digital approach to the afterlife, which is you either go to heaven or you go to hell, right? And yet you've got a whole spectrum of faith. You've got because some people really believe, right? Some people just believe. Some people believe occasionally when it suits them, midnight mass or whatever. So you get what's the level of belief that you need to get into heaven, and then what's the level of goodness, doing nice stuff that you need to do to get into heaven. And you've got the whole spectrum of people existing, and then you throw all of them into only one of two pots. You're like, yeah, these people get complete heaven and these people get complete hell. So the only way I can make sense of this is if you had graduated heaven and graduated hell. In other words, you've got a whole spectrum of afterlife that represents a spectrum of life. That's the only, but that's not what almost all theists believe.
Yeah, it's incoherence. I mean, it doesn't matter how do you sort of think about it, it's always going to be contradictory to me. It's just it doesn't make sense. And of course, when you add the non-resistant non-belief, divine hiddenness, but it's what it's called actually, non-resistant non-belief. It's people like you and I. I've no bias against God. I'm open to experiences. I'm happy to be, because they said, what's been said before, if God really knows Jonathan, he would know exactly what would make Jonathan believe. It might be an intellectual, clue or whatever, emotional, some whatever. He will be able to access you. The fact that you are not resisting and you're blocked from that, whose fault is that?
So I think we talked about this in a previous episode of ideas of sufficiency. So I argued with Dave Armstrong, who's a Catholic apologist, about sufficiency, and he didn't really understand it. He said everyone's got sufficient evidence to believe. It's like they evidently don't, because they don't believe. So it's not sufficient for them. So I said, stop projecting onto other people. This is a really common tactic, which is like, I, as a Christian apologist, believe in Christ, right? So they say. And that's enough evidence for me to believe. Therefore, it's enough evidence for everyone to believe. It's like you're projecting your entire life onto other people. Everyone has different brains, different experiences, different ways of coming to conclusions. Like the analogy I use is a car, and like, right, my old Ford Focus out there, put in 5 liters of petrol and it'll get you to Portsmouth, right? Okay, brilliant. So that's sufficient fuel to get to Portsmouth, sufficient goodness to get to heaven, right? Or sufficient evidence to believe in God, right? You've got sufficient fuel to get to Portsmouth. But yeah, but if I bring out my Humvee, like 5 liters of petrol ain't going to do the trick. Or if I bring out my bicycle, just pouring petrol all over, it's not going to get that to Portsmouth. And if I've got a hole in my fuel tank, that's not going to get me to. So in other words, sufficiency depends on the context of everything there, not just like you imagining you are this one car. Or so sufficiency is context dependent, and you're absolutely right. What is sufficient for someone to believe in anything is not always sufficient for someone else to believe in that same thing.
Because the other scenario is suggesting that everybody who's non-believer is resistant, which means it's a deliberate act. There is a God. You're going to be roasted, but you just don't feel like it. You're not in the mood. You're just like, I've
just got anger issues with my father, or stuff like this. You often hear like, yeah, you're just angry with your father. That's it. I actually believe in God. I just really don't like my dad. So that I'm not believing. I'm just, it's again, doxastic voluntarism. Like, I'm choosing not to believe. People don't do that. That's not how life works.
Maybe you're into his wife Ashra. That's a Freudian thing, the Oedipus complex.
Oh dear, now this is a dark path going down. So you get this scenario of like, what gets you into heaven? Because even if you believe in the, like, whatever the arbitrary level is to get into heaven or hell, you can imagine these really odd situations, right? Okay, well, not odd, but real situations. Like, you got an 80-year-old person who's lived 79.99 years as a complete bastard, right? And then the last kind of week of their life, they are such an amazing, they just have an epiphany and they become this amazing Christian, for example. So the 79.9 years of their atheistic life, murdering people and being terrible, and then the last week just being amazing. Does that get them into heaven? What about if they spent 99.9%? Sorry, I probably said the numbers wrong. It's my MS brain. 99.9% of their life being amazing Christians, and then the last week of their life becoming a murderous atheist. It's like, does that invalidate them from getting into heaven now? I mean, what are the criteria going on here? And then everywhere in between. What if someone's been like 50.1% good and 50% is a cutoff mark? And does that get you into heaven with the 99.9% person? So hang on, I've been like well short of what this guy is in doing good deeds and in having great faith, like to the tune of 49 point whatever percent, 9%, and yet we end up in the same place. And then the same with, like, if I'm 49.9% bad, I just miss out on heaven, so I'm going to hell along with Hitler. Like, and that's not, I just stole a loaf of bread. What's going on here? So the idea is that you get this, again, spectrum that gets you into one pot, and that's a real problem. But the idea of being good all your life and then bad, or bad all your life and good, and what happens there. Neil Sendlak, who runs Gnostic Informant channel, is the Gnostic Informant. He had a pastor, and he showed me his video, and I took the transcript of the video. This was his actual pastor talking in church. He said, not that I would ever do this, but if you gave me an AK-47 right now with enough ammo to take you all out before I did it, I started blaspheming the Holy Ghost's name, because that's apparently the worst part. There's not shooting his entire congregation, but blaspheming the Holy Ghost's name. And then took you out and then put a gun in my mouth, I still end up in heaven. Sorry, that probably wouldn't happen, as before I got to do it, the Lord would stop me. Of course he would. He might take me out before I got my finger on the trigger, but that's the power of the salvation. It's all the work of the Lord. So there are certain groups of believers who believe that if you have salvation, if you've been saved once, you are saved forever, and it doesn't matter what you do after that time of being saved.
That is insane thinking. That's like it's a immunization from like a COVID injection, but for faith.
Yeah,
it's insane.
But a lot of people believe that. That's a really common belief. So, as I say, the only way around it for me is some kind of weird matrix that God has, some kind of calculation, logarithmic, whatever, opens a book and goes, well, you've had this amount of faith and you've done that amount of good deeds, so you're going to get to this amount of heaven. Do you know what I mean? Because it's unfair still to give. It's still unfair to have this digital idea. Like, if you've just got heaven where everyone does the same thing in heaven, and you got hell where everyone is eternally tormented consciously for the same amount of like pain, then that's still that digital approach is totally, that binary approach is totally unfair.
That could be a great idea for a movie or something. Imagine there are degrees of heaven and degrees of hell, and eventually, you got the 7 heaven, and each level of the heavens have the certain hierarchies, and if the higher in heaven you are, you have access to better fruits, and then eventually these groups interact together, and then they go start comparing. It's like, oh shit, we don't have that fruit in level 3, and then suddenly there is a revolution within it.
But then, because you would want something transformative, I would guess. But then it is like, I only want to get to that level because I want the good stuff, not because I'm only being good. And this is actually, you brought on a really good point here. So and I think The Good Place talks about this. If you've ever seen the series on Netflix.
Oh yes, The Good Place. Yeah.
So it really plays around with loads of these ideas, well worth watching. But it's the idea that, and Christians always have, I say Christians, but I mean theists who believe in ECT or heaven. Like, you've got these consistent emotional blackmail bribes on your shoulder, so that can you ever be truly moral when you're saying, right, why are you being good? Well, because I get into heaven, or because I want to avoid hell. So are you being good for the sake of being good? Like, is this about you doing good for other people from a truly altruistic point of view, or is this all about you? This is actually really self-centered because it's your passage to heaven or your passage away from hell. So it's very difficult to argue that someone who believes in that kind of idea of the afterlife is ever being truly moral, because even when they think they are, just in the back of their mind, they've got the whole heaven and hell thing that are bribing them, which makes it all self-centered.
Because, Jonathan, even morality is distorted. Even the act of morality, it's conceived as this is the act, or the script is given to all of us to entertain God. God is handing over the script of morality, and we're just enacting them to please God. But if you understand them to be a tool we have evolved to improve the dealing with each other, and it's always with information, new knowledge coming in, then you sorry, was I cut there for a second?
Yeah, you were sort of all distorted, electronically distorted.
Yeah.
So
I had an internet description.
Yeah, you're being that again. I don't know if I'm being that back to you. But I fully agree. Like, if you can still hear me, I fully agree that yes, there's definitely this issue of being able to, even if you're saying, okay, I'm not being good for heaven and hell, I'm being good to please God. It's still about still about me and my relationship. You know, I'm not being good for the sake of the world or for the sake of other entities and the benefit of other entities. It's for the benefit of me and my relationship with God, or me and my chance of getting into heaven or avoiding hell. So yeah.
Yeah. There's a lot of definitions are sort of distorted when you are in that faithful realm. Nothing really, everything is explained away through the will of God, and you don't need really evidence. Everything is, I mean, it started from like the Platonic, movement of nothing is actually even real. Whatever you're seeing is a reflection of the true essence of perfection, and we just see distorted images, a broken world, and we can't wait. We can't wait for it to be all over, and some would actually push it to be over. You know, like you get the evangelical, you want that Messiah to come and the end of days, so we can just rush and live into that eternal bliss, which is quite dangerous.
Well, actually, you bring up another point there, slightly tangentially, which is a kind of anti-natalist point, or at least like if you have a baby and you think, right, there's more chance this baby's going to go to hell than heaven, knowing what we know about the difficulty to get to heaven, as according to the Bible itself,
Yeah.
then actually I really should kill this baby, because I will, you know, the understanding that babies go straight to heaven type thing that you often hear, I should kill this baby because actually I will be saving it the very, very large chance of it going to hell.
Has to be
You know?
baptized first, though. Otherwise, they go to limbo. Catholics are a big sort of apologized after centuries of torment. They say, "Oh, sorry, we got that limbo thing kind of confused. Maybe not."
Just the weird rituals of these different denominations. It's like, yeah, the true Christianity. I mean, what's the true? You know, but this is important. Like, if you're talking about eternal life is at stake here, and you're like, oh yeah, you didn't get baptized. Yeah, but that wasn't my fault. Or like this and that. You know, I don't know. It's all nonsense, of course. But there's another really interesting argument as well. Now, imagine there are possible worlds that could be created. So let's call them World 1, World 2, I don't know, World 3, whatever, W1, W2. In W1, Hani Salim, this is the world we live in now, becomes an infidel, right? And you're going to go to hell. But this is the world that God has chosen to create. So he's designed and created this world knowingly that Hani Salim will go to hell eternally, right? But he could, the counterfactual is that if he created World 2, which has got a slightly different setup, a few things are different, maybe a physical constant's different there, or like this, the world was created in a slightly different way, right? In W2, Hani Salim is born, but in that world, he actually believes in God and gets to go to heaven, right? So the counterfactual that if World 2 is created, Hani Salim goes to heaven is true. And the counterfactual that if W1 is created, he goes to hell. So God then chooses to create W1. Well, then that's unfair, because actually, as you say, as a non-resistant non-believer, like actually, if God had created a different world, Hani would have gone to heaven. So it's unfair that God creates this world that condemns a whole bunch of people to hell that in another world would have actually gone to heaven. Like, yeah. So actually, which world is created out of the infinite number of worlds that could be created?
And you know what? It actually makes, I'm thinking physics here now. Suddenly my brain's gone to physics, because in the many worlds interpretation, you know, the Sean Carroll, that's called the Everett's interpretation. Yeah. Everett's interpretation of the quantum mechanics. If God acts in himself in different ways in different verses, then he himself is subject to different realms. He is not the steady, fixed, eternal being we know he is. He changes the rules of the games with every universe, and therefore he's subject to the same rules that we're subject to, being different. Because if the God is eternal and one and is the most fundamental essence of everything, then he should be just one. But the fact that he changes or could possibly change with the different rules, then he's subject to the same rules as we are, and therefore he is not fundamental. He is emergent.
you do get interesting problems that arise out of the idea of time, for example. So if you understand as time as space-time part of the four-dimensional kind of fabric of the universe, many Christian philosophers argue, so William Lane Craig is someone who does this, I think, will argue that God enters time into time at the creation of the universe. So God was atemporal and then entered into time. But of course, if you've got like different, you know, that's just a way that God is interacting with the physics of this universe to bring about certain outcomes, including, you know, his own outcomes as interacting with this universe. So yeah, there are elements of that understanding even with this sort of basic single universe idea that God interacting. And then divine foreknowledge. I was going to get on another rant about divine foreknowledge. Divine foreknowledge is the biggest thorn in the side of omni-God. So this all-loving, all-knowing, all powerful God. Divine foreknowledge is the biggest problem. If God knows all future events and then condemns people to hell, that's terrible. So I do understand some theologians are moving away from divine foreknowledge into something called open theism, but then that presents so many more problems, in my opinion.
Yeah, and it begs the question: what kind of concept that every time it gets faced with overwhelming evidence and paradoxes, it's like it's almost like Mormonism when it first revealed to John Smith, and black people were not allowed into the church, and then the world is moving towards equality, and it says, oh, hold on, the angel Maronite came with a new revelation. Black people can now enter, and it's insane.
How convenient.
Yes, hallelujah.
Yeah. So talking about, continue, chapter 23 is explaining the heaven me. So when you do get to heaven, you get further problems with like, okay, but what is me in heaven? We've talked about in the previous episode how the soul is a really problematic idea anyway. So how does a soul represent you on earth if it's not causally interacting and responsible for your behavior? How can you be punished or rewarded if your soul doesn't actually, your soul is a bit that's being punished or reward, but if it doesn't, if your soul isn't responsible for what you do each and every day that gets you to heaven or hell, then how can it be punished on behalf of this? So therefore the soul must be causally responsible. But then how does that make sense? Like what is the soul? Because I understand my consciousness as causally, interacting. Arguably, it depends whether you believe in something called epiphenomenalism or not, but whatever. Everything that we know about us is explained by stuff that we already explain it with. So the soul is just some kind of weird thing that we can't quite explain, but we need it to be so important to us that it is what is the vehicle that gets us to the afterlife and is punished or rewarded on our behalf because somehow it is us. So there's a whole like mess of the soul. But anyway, we've talked about that previously. The idea that when we go to heaven, what is it that is me in heaven? So for example, let's go back to this 80-year-old person, right, got dementia. Like is a good believer, whatever, does all the right stuff to get to heaven, but then completely doesn't remember who anyone is. So the consciousness of this believer at the age of 80 is really affected by this physical scenario of dementia. Goes to heaven. So are they walking around heaven with dementia? What represents this person in heaven? Because they are their brain and their mind, right? We are our brain and our mind. I am what I feel now, and what I feel now is my mind and my consciousness. And we can talk about mind body in emergence of the mind, but it's depending on the brain. It depends what kind of philosophy you have here. But the idea is that if you're going to extract me and take me into heaven, then I am who I am right now. So when I die, I've got a really problematic brain scenario, which gives me a really problematic, really like imperfect psychology and psyche. Then if that's what me in eternity in heaven, then that's weird. Like I'm walking around heaven, not remembering anything from 1 minute to the next, like as a dementia-ridden human. So, okay, if that's not good enough for you, then what is me when I get to heaven? Is it as a 80-year-old person? Is it an average of me? How do you work that out? Is it like the optimal me when I was 30? Well, what's the arbitrary?
That's what some Muslims believe, that you're brought to a certain sort of younger age of yourself. If you, for example, you had disability, it's gone, and everything is restored to what it should have been. But you're right, because and it doesn't have to be dementia. It could be even experiences between the age of 30 and 80 that made you who you are right now. The death of one of your children, the victory of a certain thing that you've achieved in life. All these accumulative events become you, and then you strip them away and you bring you back to the age of 27, who you actually might have hated. You might have gone, I was a little shit when I was 27. I hate if I face myself right when I was 27, I'll punch me in the face.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a real problem, like working out exactly what it is. It me as a blastocyst, as a 5-year-old, as a 27-year-old, what is me? And of course, I believe in a non-continuous I. So I think we are different people from one instant to the next, albeit
Agreed.
very marginally. There's something called the ship of Theseus, which is a thought experiment, which is if you have a ship and then you replace every single, piece of wood, nail, sail of that ship, is it still the same ship? Or is it, marginally different each time you're replacing parts of it? And, there's lots of really fascinating philosophy on the philosophy of identity and continuous identity over time, and whether that's something
even physically. I think remind me. I think every 7 years, every single human atom, apart from the brain, apparently it stays the same.
Well, I think the brain does as well. Like, I think that might be a bit of an urban myth, but I think maybe slower. But I think every atom, there is that, which is exactly this point. So again, what represents you in heaven as or hell, as to be the one that is somehow connected to the you that was doing all the stuff throughout your life. And as you say, when you were 27, you might have been doing some horrible stuff, and you were much nicer when you were 58. But like, what's the perfect version? It seems so arbitrary. It's kind of, if anyone gets a chance to watch Midnight Mass on Netflix, which is really interesting. Like, it's sold as a horror, but actually it's more of a bit of a philosophical treatise on religion and heaven and hell and the afterlife and stuff like that. Well, not really heaven and hell, but it's absolutely fascinating. But that they talk a lot about death in that, and there's some really great monologues in there of like what they saw themselves as entering into heaven, how they would if that was the case. And then the very last big monologue on that is actually, I don't believe in heaven anymore. This is me, Stardust, and all this. And it was just an amazing bit of writing. But that's just a little tip. Go and watch Midnight Mass. So what if I had certain vices, like I like Class A drugs, and that was part of who I was, but I get to go to heaven? I get angry every so often in certain situations, or a little bit, does that just get wiped out of who you are when you go to heaven? But then how am I me in heaven if I get all my foibles and vices taken away from me? Like, what does it mean to be me? I'm not being me in heaven. I'm some clean.
It's what I call, Jonathan, divine lobotomy.
That's a brilliant term. I'm going to write that in my book
right now.
I'm literally writing that on my page. Divine lobotomy. I love that. But that's absolutely right. It's like you're going to get sanitized, filtrated, and you'll become a new version of yourself. Yeah, but that's not me. You're changing me and then rewarding me on behalf of the actual me in some new version of me. I don't know. It seems rather weird.
Kind of vegetable at that point.
Some people think it's a potential you, and this was investigated. This was talked about in that program, Midnight Mass. It's like when she was like going through her Christian phase, she was saying like, because her kid died, and this is the reason I'm telling you this, is this is what a lot of people think. It's like, my kids died at the age of, I don't know, as a baby or as a 3-year-old, right? You think they go to heaven? Well, then what are they, just crawling around in heaven, just barely being able to speak, and just, I don't know, being a toddler? Or, as she was saying, do they become the potential then? But what is a potential then? Potential then, just in any universe or in this universe, then what they would have become. But how do we know? And it creates just as many problems as it seeks to solve. And all it ends up being is something to comfort the mother, in this case, who has lost their child. The idea that it become the potential them in heaven is, I don't know. Anyway, all those problems revolve around not just how you get to heaven, but who you are when you're in heaven and or hell.
And it shows how ill-defined faith is, that people have to come with millions of versions to plug in all the loopholes.
But that's what I say. It's suitably vague, so people then plug in whatever they want to be, whatever makes them feel better. Heaven and hell becomes kind of functional beliefs that act as comfort blankets. Their function is to comfort people. It's again terror management theory, mortality salience. I understand I'm going to die, so I'm going to just create some kind of comfort blanket that allows me to get through my daily
I
existence.
thought about something else. So like the Boltzmann brain situation, where it's again from physics, where if the ultimate reason for the whole existence to happen is all through the consciousness in the brain, why have bodies at all? Just have brains. And heaven can be like that.
Well, you've jumped the gun, mate. That's argument number 20, whatever.
Brilliant.
That is coming. So I'll quickly run through the next one because it's super quick. So 24 is free will, the problem of evil and heaven. So the idea is that you get this theodicy, which is an explanation or a defense on how we can, how you can have an all-loving, all-powerful, and all-knowing God design and create the universe, but there be so much suffering. What explains all this suffering given God's omni qualities? So one of the theodicies that's given is that free will, in order for us to have free will, which must be such a great making property, it's so important that we have it, even though when we use it, sometimes we choose badly and the collateral damage is a whole load of suffering. But so people say, why is there so much suffering on Earth? Because we've got free will, right? And it's just the natural collateral of free will. But free will is so important that it's worth having all that suffering so that we can have free will. So this is a really common theodicy. Now, if you take on that theodicy and you believe in heaven, you've got a really big problem. Because if free will is such an important, great making property, then one would assume we would have it in heaven. If it's so important that human beings have free will, we need it in heaven. Unless you accept that we are just automata, like driving through heaven in some kind of robotic manner without being able to use free will. So if we can have if we are the same kind of human beings, if you like, in heaven that we are on Earth, then we have free will. But in heaven there can be no suffering. So the idea is you do have free will in heaven, but you don't have any suffering. Well, if that's the case, so if you can have free will without suffering, why is that not the case on Earth? So why has God not created human beings with free will? So they're still acting freely, but it just so happens that there's suffering. And there is this philosophical argument to say, actually, free will doesn't logically necessitate suffering. It just so happens that most of the times we do use free will, if you agree it exists. I don't. If you adhere to libertarian free will, it just so happens that inductively, we tend towards making bad decisions, but it's not logically entailed. So the idea that heaven should exist and we have free will and there's no suffering creates a real problem for why there is suffering on Earth and we have free will.
Yeah, and it's counterintuitive as well, because when you bring children to this world, your kids and your pets, you don't go, I'm going to let my children live in my house, but I want them to grow through some experiences. So I'm going to fill the house with a bit of nails and bits and pieces, so my kids will learn the right skills to face the world after me. But we don't do that. We know that when we have children, we have pets, we want to give them the best possible experience and guard it from all harm. And still, you manage to teach them the necessary skills, but you bring them to life, and you cover them with love and care. But this is very strange love that God provides us here.
The idea that God is a father, you hear this figurative language all the time, this metaphor that God is our father, not God the Father, the Godhead, but literally is a father figure to us, and the love that he has for us is as father to child. It's like, no, that's not the case at all. So, if my kid as a toddler tramples on a flower bed at the local play school or whatever I take them to, right, I don't take them home, beat them to within an inch of their life over a 5-day period and then give them cancer. But then don't tell them why I've done that. I'm not connecting them trampling on the flowers to the terrible things I've done to them. But actually, that's what happens with the problem of suffering, is that we are being punished. There's all this horrible, there's tsunamis and cancer and all this terrible stuff. And God hasn't told us why that's happening. There's no explanation of why a tsunami killed 240,000 people in Indonesia in 2004. God didn't come down and say, oh, by the way, I did that. It's because of the gays. or I did that because of, they're all infidels or whatever. Like, it just literally, it happens. And then we're left going, well, I wonder why that happened. So it's like a toddler going, well, I wonder why I've just been beaten up by my dad for 5 days and given cancer.
Yeah.
Is it because is it because I trampled on the flowers, or is it because what?
And sometime else, just to confuse you, not even punish you, but kill your pit rabbits.
Yeah. It's just like, and those
just
animals,
to get to you.
Yeah. Terrible. So the argument I just gave you was either we are designed and created such that it is logically impossible for us to choose well every time, causing suffering. So that's free will necessarily gives us, in which case that's pretty poor design. Or God has chosen those of us when creating who would just happen to choose badly, also causing suffering. So if we could choose well, you see, there's this idea that God could create a world where everyone just chose to freely love God. It is logically possible that that concept could exist, where literally everyone chose to love God and freely came to, and always chose correctly. But he hasn't chosen to make that world. So he's purposely chosen a world where there is suffering, where people do.
It's actually
not to love
one
it.
of the first imagined worlds in the non-resistant non-belief that are divine hiddenness. That is a possible coherent world. Yeah, we could imagine. God exists, and everybody believes in that God.
It's not logically impossible. It's not logically impossible. So people say it's unfeasible, like it's unlikely. Yeah, but it's not logically impossible. They could, given God's got creative dominion over anything and everything, like, and it has all the choice of all possible worlds, he could have created that one if it's logically possible.
I mean, the angels are. I mean, some angels were created before humans. You would agree, according to the narrative of religion. And that realm existed. These were creatures of light that were there to serve, and they are in the presence of God, and therefore they cannot deny him, and everything was honky-dory.
Until Lucifer, which is a weird thing anyway, because in the presence of God, knowing God's omnipotent, it's like, yeah, I'm going to reject that. Like, what are you doing? Like, surely, like, you know that is good. Like, he's omni, right? So you can't win this one. You can't go, I'm going to have a revolution.
But you know what? Kudos, a man of principle, though.
Yeah. I know that God could do that and kill me straight away, but I'm going to have a revolution anyway. And ends up living in peaceful coexistence and being given a whole dominion to lord it over. Like, oh, well done, mate. Well done for your revolution. I'm going to give you hell to look after. It'd be like, awesome. Yeah, thanks very much. Anyway, sorry, I'm being facetious. So the idea is, why not create heaven? So this is argument 25, which is just create heaven. So if God has full divine foreknowledge of all these different scenarios, all these different worlds, right? He's created this world where the vast majority of people are going to go to hell, right? And he designs a world such that this happens. So that it's all factored into the design phase. Then he creates it knowing that it will happen, right? And then it happens, and then he throws all those people in hell, right, which he knew would happen. So this is like, as I said earlier, this is moral abhorrence on God's part, right? Designs, creates, throws into hell and heaven. The point is, he throws some people into heaven, right? And albeit a smaller group of people, supposedly. But the idea is that if the end game is heaven, right? If that's where we're going here, and the eternity, that's the vast amount of time. Like, the reality of this physical universe is infinitesimally small compared to existence of eternity in heaven, right? Forget all this bit, the bit where everyone suffers and dies and has punishment on earth, right? Forget the hell bit, which makes you look like a complete psychopath, right? And just create the heaven bit. You know who's going to get to heaven, right? You know it in advance. There's no point doing this test. Right, if you know the answers, like as a teacher, I talked about this in a previous episode. If I was a teacher, right, and I knew exactly, like I'm a godlike teacher, I knew exactly what all my students in the class knew, right? I knew every single factoid in their head that they knew. I knew what they knew. There would be no point in me testing them, because the test is for me to understand what they know, right? It's to give me an understanding, summarizing their learning up to that point. Right? But if I know that, there's no point in me testing them. Right, because I already know that. God knows who's going to pass the test of getting into heaven and hell. Right? What's the point in giving them the test and then committing those who failed the test, which you already knew were going to fail the test, into hell, and rewarding those with heaven that you already knew were going to pass, and then you're committing them to suffering on this earth? Don't do that. Throw the people in heaven that you knew were going to get to heaven, and just create heaven. Just create heaven. End of.
especially when you add to the equation the notion that it's not just a mere knowledge, because it looks like sometimes he actually authors what you're doing, like hardening the Pharaoh's heart. I mean, he's actually sort of authored the action. He's not just knowing it. He's actually writing the script for Pharaoh to enact.
Yeah, that's a terrible part. The Exodus story is actually a really horrible story. The problem is it's taught to us before we get the ability to kind of morally evaluate these stories from a proper point of view. So we think, oh, the 10 plagues of Egypt. We almost think, oh, the 10 plagues of Egypt. 10 plagues of Egypt were absolutely disgusting, right? And it just vicious masochism. Or sadism, actually. Sorry, I probably got the wrong. Whatever, the one where you.
Well, whoever wrote it is a masochist.
Well, yeah. So and you get yeah, it's just horrible. And then he's killing like children on behalf of what the leader of the country. Firstborn children on behalf of what the leader of the country says, and he's hardened that leader's heart. Yeah, it's a terrible story. Horrible. So yeah, just create heaven is really simple. Actually, one of my favorite arguments. It's just like I've never seen a good defeater to that. Never seen one. And then actually, I did jump the gun. So the next one is Satan is God's middle manager. So I've already said that, which is if God's omnipotent, then anything that Satan does is done on the behest of God. So you cannot blame Satan for anything. You can't blame Satan for placing the fossils if you're a young Earth creationist and say, oh, that's just Satan playing around with us there. Well, that's God's will. That is, if that happened, is God's will. If anything that happens on the universe, literally anything that happens is God's will. That's how God is designed. And if God didn't want it to happen, God could stop that from happening. So if you get cancer in the next week, anyone watching this, and I hope you don't, but if you do and you believe in God, like that's what God wants. Like literally, God knows that's going to happen, and God wants that. So you have to try and dress that up. You have to explain every bit of data in the universe as a believer in light of omnigod. So you have to say, right, God wants me to get cancer and die in 6 weeks. Like, how do I sell that? How do I still maintain this belief that God is all good? So I have to go, well, it's all right. I'm going to live in heaven forever. So it's that bribery again. It's my get out of jail free card is the fact I'm going to go to heaven forever. And that's all right. And maybe, it'll build up my soul, my character or something. It's like, oh, no, it's just morally horrible. That's all it is. So the next argument, 27, is infinite punishment for finite crime. So the idea that you're going to go to heaven or hell, so infinite punishment or reward is both incoherent for a finite activity, which is like, I've done these things and I believe these things on earth over a 37-year period. If you're a 37-year-old and you die when you're 37 and then you go to heaven, or you go to hell, you're punished for eternity. Hang on, 37. So let's discount childhood because, there you go. We put in these arbitrary constraints. I mean, you can't be a moral character, but as soon as you hit some 18 or in this country or in that country or whatever, you suddenly become a moral agent. And it's like, and then you are morally responsible. Actually, I'd say you're not morally responsible at all at any point because you're just who you are in the situation you're in. And we get to talk about libertarian free will again. But that aside, you're in heaven and hell for eternity. And that okay, I mean, you may have done some pretty terrible stuff here, but how about maybe a bit of rehabilitation? But is it fair to be punished eternally for something that you did only over maybe a couple of short weeks? I don't know.
So the reincarnation, even though I don't believe in it, it's probably a lot more plausible. It has the element of refining yourself over a period of time. So actually, I don't believe in it, but when you compare it to the Abrahamic, blunt, in your face, kind of incoherent, it actually makes a little bit sense. You come back and you're trying to get better, but however, you don't have the memory of the, so therefore it's not really, you don't have access to it. So, but imagine if you have access to it.
Well, I mean, there's a slightly different thing as well. Like if you are in heaven for eternity, genuinely some believers believe this. If you're in hell for eternity, they justify that by saying you continue to sin. It's like, you what? So I'm literally in the worst place on earth or in human conception. I'm being punished. There's absolute torment here. and I think it's a really good idea to continue sinning, just so I continue my torment. It's like, no,
But how do you commit a sin there? Like,
well, yeah,
what,
I mean, you got all these problems, like, yeah, but
you're
there you go.
probably too busy trying to gather your falling limbs of your body.
Exactly. So I found this. I was just hunting around the internet, trying to get what lay people's understanding of heaven and hell were, and I thought this was a really good synopsis of hell for a lot of people. So this was answering, I think it was a Quora question, answering, is there a way to reconcile all of these issues with the unfairness of hell, right? Which is the kind of question I would ask. And this guy says, the short answer is yes. Where I grew up, hell was a very real place, and I knew that many people would end up there. It was reconciled in a few ways, and he lists 3 ways that hell was reconciled. 1, they deserve it. Right? If you take on an us versus them mindset, view other people as bad, you don't worry so much about them going to hell. So it's a really useful thing, right? Is what we said earlier. I'm all right. You guys suck. You're going to hell. Us versus them. Number 2, everyone can make a choice. God reveals himself to all. Everybody who is going to hell is going there because of their choice. So it's their fault. The whole libertarian free will, oh, you chose to. You deserve that. And the 3rd one is don't talk about it. That became the most common way to reconcile it. So as I explored and asked questions, I realized that all 3 of those ways to reconcile it were flawed once you gave them closer scrutiny. For me, the concept of hell was the first crack in the armor of my belief. And then he goes on to talk about, how he lost that belief. But I've spoken to a lot of people who say that actually hell, the moral abhorrence of hell and the philosophical incoherence of the idea was one of the first cracks. Like, recognizing that was one of the first cracks in their deconversion away from religious belief. And you can understand that because hell is really awful. And if you are looking at people who are good people in your life, and you think, yeah, but they don't qualify for the traditional criteria of getting into heaven, then actually these really nice people are going to go to hell. These are 2 really good people, but they just happen to be gay. They're going to hell. Well, I've got some questions about this whole thing type scenario. So you find that hell is often a route out of religion. Would you agree?
Just had an idea there. So the evolution of our consciousness has led us to develop the idea of heaven and hell through justice and injustice, because these are abstract ideas, and also became the solution through empathy. So because through empathy, which is in the frontal lobe cortex as well, along with consciousness, we've condemned ourselves, we've created hell, but then we empathize with those who we love and say, well, they couldn't possibly be going to, I know they're good people. They don't deserve that. So it looks like that consciousness of ours is the reason and the solution for everything.
Well, you recently interviewed Derek Lambert, didn't you, of Myth Vision? I'm sure.
I'm having him on in a week's time.
Oh, sorry, you're having him on this week. So here's a good example, right? So here's someone who was a really committed Christian that deconverted, right? And the rest of his family are still Christians, right? Broadly speaking. And so when they have a nice Christmas dinner and you're looking around the table, the rest of his family could be thinking, oh, we love Derek, but he's probably going to hell now. Like, then you start thinking, well, okay, but that can't be true because I know Derek's a really nice, he's like my brother or my son, and he's a really nice guy and all this kind of stuff. So therefore he's not going. So then you're like, okay, now I have to rearrange my theology to make this fit. And it's the whole like desires first, theology second, which is like, I don't want him to go to hell. So he's not going to hell. How do I work this out? So it turns out that, I used to believe it was all about faith that gets you to heaven. It turns out actually it can't just be faith. It must be deed. And so you end up bastardizing your belief structures.
So maybe that Pope is a genius.
Yeah. Well,
because he's probably trying to fix that torment from families, because instead of them straying away from their faith, I'm going to give them something to comfort them so they can stay put.
Yeah, because either you shed, well, you either adapt, or you us versus them in your family, and you are going to hell, and you're an evil person. We can't have you around for Christmas anymore. It's like that plays merry havoc with your own kind of psychology and whatnot. So it's like, okay, I'm accepting you, but I have to, otherwise, unless I convince you to believe again, in which case I've succeeded. But that's never going to happen by the looks of it, and that's a lot of effort. And it's not going to happen. So actually, I need to now you need to be going to heaven, even though you're an atheist, and that's that. So yeah, you can understand why this happens. But the whole heaven hell thing can be put a real strain on people's religious beliefs.
Agreed.
So that's the end of the afterlife section of the book, and we move on really to the end of the book, which is any other business type thing. Unless there's anything else you want to say about heaven and hell, I mean, there's lots more I can say.
No, I think I'm very happy now to progress, because we're above an hour and a half now, and I think we'll probably in the next 25 minutes we can maybe talk about.
Yeah. So I'll try and wrap it up quickly. You know me, I'm always quick with what I say. Argument 28 is prayer makes little sense. So this is going back to the idea of God is has divine foreknowledge, so knows all future events before they're going to happen, all 3D world future events, if you like. Well, what's the point of praying? Okay, there's lots of different reasons to pray. So you might be to adore, praise, and worship. Well, that's kind of weird anyway. Why would you praise someone who's killed 240,000 people in a tsunami? That's weird. Also, why would someone who's perfect require praise and worship? Now, that's weird. If you have ontological perfection, you have no needs, no lacks. Why would you need people to worship you? Why would you want people to worship you?
Unless it's the very ancient communication of that strong spirit that might crush you if they're not happy with you. So you're praying out of fear.
That's exactly what it is. So these things have evolved out of, well, certainly the worship aspect evolves out of the idea that if we don't worship, then the sun ain't going to rise or the rains ain't going to come and all this kind of stuff. So you got that leftover kind of from older times. But philosophically, I think like praise is a weird thing for someone who's ontologically supposedly perfect, but had no choice in being that way. This is just who they are. It's like me praising like a perfect, like I don't know, mountain or something that I think just like praising that. I might say that looks beautiful, but I won't praise it. I'm not going to worship it because it's like the best version of a mountain. Like it had no choice of being like that. And I don't think God has any choice of being like God is. God is constrained by God's own necessary characteristics. It's like me praising or worshipping a robot. It's like, do you know what I mean? There's just some weird, like,
like in our realm, like if somebody comes to a room, like a CEO, and they're quite liberal in their communication and they're humble and talking to people and people talking, they understand their value, they respect them so much, but they don't need to act out any sort of weird behavior. But imagine somebody else who in constant need for praise, and it doesn't usually lead to some sort of confidence and insecurity if that's what the kind of leader you are.
Yeah, it sort of reflects that, and the requirement for validation. I mean, we all do it to some extent. We all love a bit of praise, that's part of human nature. But we are humans, right? And we are insecure, and we do seek validation because we're not 100% sure. We get the imposter syndrome. Do I really know what I'm talking about? Oh, someone said that I do know what I'm talking about. Brilliant, thank you. That makes me feel better.
True.
But God won't have any of that because God, of course, knows what He's talking about because God is omniscient, right? There's no one else knows more what they're talking about than God. So God shouldn't need this like constant validation and praise. It just makes very little sense. So then another reason to pray is confession, which is like, oh, I've done something wrong, I'm going to tell you about it, God. It's like God's not sitting there going, oh, did you? I never knew that. Oh, honey, you're sitting in the confession box. I never knew you nicked that loaf of bread. Oh, you little tyke. God knows.
That's why I'm Australian. That's why I'm
God's like, come on, mate. I've got like another billion people to hear at the moment. Yeah, I know you've nicked a loaf of bread. I literally designed and created you knowing that's going to happen. So you don't need to confess to me. I can see into your mind. I've got places to be. See you later. So like confession there's no need for God to be a part of confession. So confession is all about your own psychological. It's all about, making you feel better about yourself. And I think really that's what prayer is in general. Prayer is just a way of like, there's no benefit that God gets out of prayer, right? There's just making you as a human feel better.
But you can do that quite secularly, right? You don't need, you can have that conversation all the time with yourself.
Yeah,
trying to
and you get
improve
so,
and get better.
and you're like, oh, I've nicked that loaf of bread, and you have a conversation with yourself. God, you know I've nicked that, so I don't need to confess to you. You know, yeah, sorry and all that. But oh, what did I do? Do I need to do that again? Blah, blah, all this kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
You have that conversation with yourself. That's the important thing. Thanksgiving, again, it's a bit like praise. Well, I don't know why you're thanking God. God's living out exactly what God's always going to do, because he's a necessary being constrained by his own characteristics. Like, I'm not, again, thanking a robot. You know, it's funny, when we first got Alexa in, like, a couple of years ago when they all came out and whatnot, Helen was like, my partner was like, we should really say thank you afterwards and please when speaking. You know, we need. There's this idea that we've got this very human way of interacting, and like trying to teach your children to be polite, and it doesn't last long, because within like a month you're like, Alexa, I told you.
You stupid.
I wanted you to play the Christmas song, not. I didn't want the recipe for cooking a badger's ass. Like, come on. Like the idea is like please and thank you, like saying thank you to Alexa, but that's a very human thing to. But saying thank you to God is effectively just constrained by being omnipotent, omnibenevolent, and omniscient. So is completely constrained, as I talked to you about before, is a divine robot constrained by those characteristics and can't do any other than what those characteristics entail or dictate. And so therefore saying thank you to God is kind of, what's the point? Only is to make, you know, even if it's to ingratiate yourself with God, you can't change God's opinion. You know, this is always going to happen.
Yeah.
God knows that.
It always reminds me of the story from the movie, the brilliant movie, The Crying Game, when the Northern Irish soldier was sort of was taken, and he was telling the story about the frog and the scorpion. The scorpion asked the frog to cross the river on his back, and said, "Sorry, you know, you're going to sting me. Or I can't do that." So no, I won't do it, because we're going to die. In the middle of the river, he does it. He said, "Why did you do it? We're going to die together." And he said, "Sorry, it's in my nature."
It's in my nature. Yeah, I was just always going to do it, especially if you got that knowledge about yourself. So the last kind of idea of prayer is petition, supplication, which is asking for stuff, intercession, asking for God's help, someone else on, you know, or help on behalf of oneself or others, right? So this is weird too, and makes absolutely no sense. So God knows everything in advance, right? So there's no point in saying, "Dear God, please make Manchester United win this weekend," or "Dear God, please can you stop Doris having cancer," right? Because God's not going to sit up there and go, "Oh, I'd never thought of that. I had City winning. You want Man U to win? Oh, I'll change that now. Sorry about that. You are right. I got that wrong. It would have made the league much."
Sorry, mate. I had 100 on it.
Yeah. God's like, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I got a big bet on that game and I forgot to change it. Yeah, so God's never going to do that, and God is never going to go, "Oh, you want Doris not to get cancer? Oh, I'll change that now," because that makes his own foreknowledge about Doris getting cancer fallible. So God's foreknowledge cannot be fallible. He has infallible foreknowledge. So you cannot change the state of affairs from one thing to another. You cannot ask God to do that. God will never do that, because it would invalidate his own foreknowledge. So God can't change things. We talked about this in the previous episode. There's no changing the world. The world will be what it will always be, and there's no deviating from that, because any deviation from what it will be is a deviation away from God's divine foreknowledge, and that is infallible. Right, so it is what it's going to be. Is we're on one railroad track and we are hurtling towards it, and there's nothing anyone can do about that, because any deviation from that is invalidating God's omni characteristics. So don't bother praying. Like, again, prayer is only about making you feel better. Yeah, oh please God, please don't let Doris get cancer, or please let Doris's cancer get better, is not going to make Doris's cancer get better, but it might make you feel a bit better about, like, pleading on Doris's behalf, give you some control, or a perception of control over this situation that you feel a lack of control in. That's what the prayer does for you. But as far as getting God to do anything or making God feel better by worshiping, all of that is pointless, absolutely pointless, and makes no philosophical sense. So in other words, prayer is, other than from making yourself feel better, essentially a pointless exercise.
Futile.
And also you can look at the actual data involved here, which is, not only is it futile, it is also ineffective. So every single meta-analysis of prayer, broadly speaking, has found it to have no effect on this is kind of intercessory prayer. So saying, like, one example, the step example, which is the biggest one, was like, okay, we're gonna have these different groups, double blind and all this. We're gonna set up groups to pray for people that are gonna have heart surgery and blah blah blah. So you set up all these double blind. We don't know who's praying for who, and people don't know who praying for blah blah blah. It turns out that the group they had that they told, so the different control group, you have a control group and all these different variables, and the group that was told that they were being prayed for actually had higher mortality rates, so they actually died more, possibly because they put their faith in God rather than, I don't know, whatever
Apparently
else.
the results said they actually felt guilty that they were not recovering. It's almost like they're being prayed for, but they're not getting better, so they felt guilty, like they might not be worth it or something.
So anyway, but when you look at the meta-analyses of lots of these, because you will get the odd prayer experiment that looks like prayer does have effect. But what you need to do is always, in all these things, it's about replication, because you can always get anomalous data. So you need the meta-analyses that look at lots and lots. It's not doing the research itself, but looking at all the different research and looking at the patterns. And basically, the end result is, the long and the short of it is, there's no effect of prayer. You know, you'll get some that show a little bit, and then some that show there's less effect, and some that show no, and that's what you'd expect in random, basically. Random distribution of data. You basically got, there's no effect of prayer. Now, the theist comes back and says, well, you can't test God. You can't put God in a lab and test. So, fair enough. But we've done our best to see whether prayer is effective, and it's seen not to be effective. So the rest is just blind faith. So if you believe it is effective, fair enough, but you're not relying on data to do that. So not only do we see no point in praying philosophically, but there's no effect of prayer from the times that we tested it. And the ones that have had effect fit well within the distribution of data.
Even to the point where you become a saint because somebody has prayed in front of your own picture. And we're talking about Mother Teresa being made a saint. That was her second miracle, by the way, after she died. Somebody held her picture right next to somebody's got stomach cancer, and they got healed. So it's almost like there is some middle man that God would listen to your prayer a bit more if you appeal to some of his favorite people.
Yeah, you're not praying hard enough, or you're not using my favorite saint, or you're not doing it. Like, if you'd done that, then yeah, of course I would have made Doris well again. Yeah, obviously you just didn't pray through Mary, or you weren't standing on one leg, or whatever. It's just like, then this is nothing to do with Doris being made better on account of that being the right thing to do or a good thing to do. It's all about someone else doing the right thing, and it's just like, no, none of this makes sense. Just don't do it.
Whatever you do, don't pray to Saint Thomas, because he's the patron saint of old skeptics.
Patron Thomas. So 2003 meta-analysis said only 3 have sufficient rigor for review. So they looked at a load of studies and said actually only 3 of them are good enough to even review here. Most of the studies methodologically are rubbish. And it said the strongest findings were for the variables that were evaluated most subjectively. In other words, the ones that found the most data that said that prayer was most effective, the ones that were subjective. Like, how do you feel? I feel really good. I know I was prayed for. Well, okay, that's not objective data. That was this double blind? Was this no? So again, really, the only decent one was dodgy. 2006 meta-analysis said the analysis concluded that of the 14 studies, there is, quote, no discernible effect. 2007, a review of intercessory prayer produced inconclusive results, noting that the 3 most rigorous studies, so only 3 fell into most rigorous, quote, failed to produce significant findings, stating in the whole analysis that, quote, the findings are unlikely to satisfy either proponents or opponents of intercessory prayer. Well, I disagree with that, because the opponents of intercessory prayer would say there's just no effect. It's not like it's going to make you worse.
It's great.
So actually, that null response is what skeptics are.
I think it's an attempt to sound quite neutral and not satisfied, but it's
exactly effectively, they're not effective. So that's the end of that. So that's prayer done pretty quickly. And then my last argument before my bonus argument is God is not omni-God according to the Bible. So this idea of the classical God of classical theism, which is all loving, all knowing, all powerful. When you actually look in the Bible, for example, you can talk about other holy texts and other gods. You find that actually God isn't quite that. I mean, you can look at Francesca Stavrakopoulou's book, God and Anatomy, and say actually God wasn't this this kind of like philosophical abstract entity, but was actually a real.
Even in Islam, Jonathan, there is the foot of God. And there, I mean, you talk about a throne. I mean, a throne. He's got a bottom, and 8 angels carry that throne. So he's a physical entity with dims and.
Well, of course, the strong connection. The Abrahamic faith, the Hebrew Bible is broadly adhered to by those 3 faiths, marginally different ways. So yeah, there's going to be a very strong connection there. So what do I have to say about that? In the beginning was a word and all this kind of stuff from John, but Judges 1:19, we are told that Almighty God is unable to defeat the Judahites' enemies because they had iron chariots. Now the Lord was with Judah and they took possession of the hill country, but they could not drive out the inhabitants of the valley because they had iron chariots. So the Lord was with them, but that wasn't enough because they had iron chariots. Like, God, man. No wonder Ukraine's still going on, because God, if he can't defeat iron chariots, what's he going to do with like infantry fighting vehicles?
Talking about shooting yourself in the foot there, it's like and the word because like he actually said it's the reason why they.
Because they had iron chariots. Damn. Bible claims multiple times throughout that God is all powerful. So there are these claims that he's all powerful, but then there are these claims that he can't do certain things, such as that. The Tower of Babel is another story that when read literally, as many theists, they're inclined to do, shows God to be somewhat less than it should be. So what happens is humans who are full of pride and ambition get together to build a tower whose top could reach up to heaven. In seeing this, and already we have an idea that God is not omniscient. So he's seeing this and reacting rather than predicting this would happen, knowing it would happen in advance. It's like he comes across this ziggurat and goes, "Oh yeah, oh look what they've done." Right, so all these stories, they're very anthropomorphic stories, that do show, that
reactionary gods rather than
and they're very human type God. But if you want to believe these literally, you're gonna have issues, but people do. So
somebody was trying to justify the emergence of languages in that story.
So that's what it is. So it's an etiological story, which is a story to explain how languages exist. So he should have known this was going to happen. God believes that humans could become omnipotent. So, afraid that humans would become like God. They were working together so much that they could build this really tall ziggurat, which, we've built skyscrapers since then.
Sorry, we can't have human collaboration. It's horrible.
We've collaborated and gone past the moon now, like seriously.
But Jonathan, it's the second time, probably even more in the Bible, where God feared something. Remember, from the eating from the tree of good and evil, he feared that they will eat from the other tree, so they'll be like us again. He's repeating it again.
Yeah, absolutely. So, the stories like this show God to be just very much human and not all these omni characteristics. You've got, James 1:17. There is no variation or shifting shadow. So this is the idea that God is completely unchangeable. Hebrews 6:17, the fact that his purpose is unchangeable. I won't give you the quote, I'll just give you the quotes. It's impossible for God to lie. In hope of eternal life, which God, who cannot lie, promised long ages ago. God cannot be tempted by evil, and he himself does not tempt anyone. If we are faithless, he remains faithful, for he cannot deny himself. These ideas that he's unchangeable, you can't change, you can't do this, you can't do that. But at the same time, God is also supposedly omniscient. He knows everything. In Islam, he is like, he's a book, isn't he? What's the term? Everything's written in a book. What's a Quranic term about his omniscience?
So it's like a predestination type of thing.
Yeah. Isn't there like everything's written in a book type thing?
Yes. Yes, it's written in an eternal book before even your birth.
Yeah, so that's a kind of that pulls on that omniscience idea. But then God famously can't find Adam and Eve in Genesis 3. And you're like, what's going on there? Now they heard the sound of the Lord God walking in the garden. So he's like literally walking in the cool of the day. And the man and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord God among the trees in the garden. Then the Lord God called to the man and said to him, "Where are you?" Right?
It's incredible. Some Christian might say it's rhetorical.
Yes. But this kind of happens quite a lot. So Cain was able to be hidden from God. God didn't know where Sarah was. God was about to murder everyone in Sodom and Gomorrah. And God wondered, shall I hide from Abraham and what I am about to do? So almost wondering, like this kind of like, what shall I do? Or shall I do this? Like God would already know. It's already written in the book, as you say. God didn't know that Abraham feared God. God didn't know who he was wrestling with. In Genesis 32, he didn't know who was with Balaam. He didn't know what was in the Israelites' hearts for 40 years. And despite knowing what was in everyone's hearts, he didn't know whether the Israelites would obey him or not, and so on and so forth. There are so many claims or quotes from the Bible that show that God is not omniscient. So the idea, and the same with a whole bunch of these characteristics, and whether you say God is love and then you say and then he murders all these people, God is love and then the 10 plagues of Israel, like, is he really omnibenevolent? I mean, really, all the things we talked about designing, creating, and then throwing people everything and throwing people into hell, like knowingly, like, is that love? No, it's not in my book anyway. And so all these ideas that God is omni are arguably disproven by the Bible, or you shouldn't read the Bible literally, in which case it's just a bunch of kind of mythological nice stories that are very anthropocentric or anthropomorphic. Sorry.
Yeah, it's unless you into the, I haven't sort of seen this in the Olympics yet. It's yet to be a sport, but word gymnastics. If you're into that, and you want to use words like, you need to understand this holistically. Then there is that's the only game that, as you said, you hit the nail on the head.
The other story, sorry, I interrupted you.
I was going to say, we custom tailor our faith, and we can even shift it right or left and center to go with our what we feel is right. If your son is an atheist and you're religious, you will find a reason. You'll find the right texts in the Bible to prove that even everyone is going to have a shot at heaven, because you don't want it to believe otherwise.
Yeah, absolutely. So the last story along those lines is a global flood story, which is God designing, creating everything, and then realize he's done a really bad job of it and starting again, which again is not omniscience. It's like he would know that that's going to happen and would alter the design and creation. Like, humanity is going to be broken. I'm going to need to send a flood. So how about I start with a bit after the flood? How about I start why go through having to kill everyone bar 8 people? Just, so that, and also it's almost like God gets this point where he goes, oh, look how terrible humanity is. Like this sudden realization again, like he didn't know. Oh my goodness, I'm going to have to change that. I'm going to start again. Again, it just shows he's not omnipotent and not omniscient, because otherwise it would have been completely different. The bonus argument. So that's the end of the book. That's the end of the argument. Apart from I do throw in the 31st, which is an interesting one. Someone told me that Dark Matter something 25 or something. There's a YouTube channel.
Brilliant. I was actually going to bring that right now. Dark Matter. There's a cartoon about the whole thing.
Yeah, so this apparently he's done a cartoon on this, but I thought of it myself. God damn it! So there's this thing. There's the Cartesian kind of knowledge, which is, cogito ergo sum. Like I think, therefore I am, and I don't know that I'm not. So the Descartes' demon, evil demon, is his thought experiment. He didn't call it the evil demon, but it's the idea that I don't know that I'm not having all my experiences put into me. I'm not dreaming this. I'm not in a dream, and it's an evil demon that's creating this as a dream. And so it's this idea that I can't 100% know that's not the case. I can have maybe a little bit of blind faith that it's not, or I can use. I've no good reason. I have no good reason to believe it, but I can't disprove it. It's impossible for me to disprove that, because by being able to doubt I exist, but that's the only thing I can know is 100% is that I exist. Everything else has an element of skepticism attached to it. Okay, fair enough. That also applies to God. So God can't know that God isn't having all God's experience puts into its mind by God sitting above that. And then that God can't know 100%. So when you say God is omniscient, actually God can't be literally by the definition of how knowledge works, it depends how you define knowledge, right? But in a kind of 100% indubitable Cartesian sense of knowledge, God can't know that there isn't this other God above, and that can't know, and it kind of goes on infinitely. But the idea is that God isn't omniscient, at least definitionally can't be.
Yeah.
That's my bonus argument.
Have you seen the video? It's got
No,
iron rods.
I still haven't.
You have to, because eventually, so that God appears to the angel, said, I'm omnipotent, nobody can kill me. And the angel points a gun and actually kills God. And he goes to heaven, and there is another God meeting the Yahweh and say, I'm above you in rank, you know? And it keeps going up, until it came back to humanity again.
Nice.
Oh the God, that is it's fantastic. It's got Aaron Ra voiceover. It's got a few atheist voiceover. It's a brilliant little cartoon. It's 45 minutes, but it's brilliant.
Yeah, brilliant. So yeah, that's a nice little sort of thought experiment. You know, it doesn't necessarily disprove God, but none of these arguments necessarily disprove God. What they do is they disprove that version of God. So if you believe that God is all loving, all knowing, and all powerful, then you've got a problem. If you believe God's got divine foreknowledge, you've got a problem. If you believe in heaven and hell and that God designed it all this way, you've got a problem, because these things don't work. They're either mutually incompatible or they are morally abhorrent in and of themselves, kind of intrinsically. So this book is to say, right, you've got problems. So where does that leave you as a theist? Well, okay, work out what does work, but don't believe in that kind of version of God. And I'd argue you're probably not warranted in believing in God at all.
I've enjoyed this so much. I've enjoyed it. Yeah, it's about, I think we covered over 6 episodes now, but it's well worth it. I mean, it honestly, I could talk about each of these arguments in one episode alone. Honestly, each of the item would require a couple of hours to cover, and probably not enough. But I can't believe the amount. I mean, in such a nice little package, that book has got pretty much everything you can think about in terms of questioning God's existence. It's a brilliant book, Jonathan. I really congratulate you on such a great achievement, to be honest.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. And I believe you were saying before that you'd used it in a bit of a book club thing in your, is it your clubhouse? Some of your videos. So that's really great. So thank you for that.
It was completely discussed in Arabic. So I will have an episode in Arabic discussing that final part. And there will be like hundreds of Egyptian and Saudis and Emiratis, all Arab-speaking people listening in, you know, shouting at me, and I have to close the mic on them. It's an interesting
that's where you kind of understand, like the pushback, like the louder people shout, the greater their insecurities really are. Because, you know, that's their cognitive dissonance. It was like, someone's presented a rational argument against my position. I either take that on board and change my position, or I reject that outright. But I can't do that rationally because I don't have the rational arguments to do that. So I'm just going to shout and get angry and kind of throw out some pseudo rationalizations. But that's the way I reject that counter evidence. And that to me, people who shout loudest like that are the people that actually have the least to say or have the greatest insecurities. I don't know. It's just psychoanalysis analysis.
Agree. Look, I mean, you're going to be hopefully a permanent guest on Critical Faculty. I'm sure you and I are interested in philosophy, and we're going to talk about different things on either channel. So I'm sure that's not going to be the end of Jonathan, guys. You'll be seeing him again. But
I hope it's not going to be the end of me.
No, not at all. Not at all. We want you to be around for quite some time. We got plans for you. Just like God. Do you want to share with
you are my God.
Do you want to share with the audience any future projects that you're thinking about, or you want to introduce people to?
Yeah, so 2 things. First of all, there's a book that should be coming out next 3 months. I'm writing with Dr. Aaron Adair. Have you interviewed Aaron Adair?
Yes, he's a wonderful gentleman.
Yeah, he's a great guy. So we just did another couple of videos on a nativity. So we've got a book coming out, Aliens and Religion, Where Two Worlds Collide. So this is
that coming into this month?
No, probably a couple of months. So
it's been delayed.
That's probably end of February. But that's that's the impact of discovering intelligent alien life would have on theology and religions, and whether you people like have brain melts if we discovered intelligent aliens, and how that would affect the deepest of their theological ideals. I've also, at some point, I've got the third part to my trilogy of books: The Nativity, A Critical Examination; The Resurrection, A Critical Examination of the Easter Story; and the third one is The Exodus, A Critical Examination of the Moses Story. I'm writing that with an archaeologist, but I might finish that book myself because I know she's got some health issues. So that's one that's half written, and I'm really excited. The Exodus story is so integral to the Christian and Jewish belief, and arguably the Islamic belief as well. And to find it completely ahistorical, or largely ahistorical, and hugely theologically problematic, is to say that the whole religion upon which it's based, it has problems. So there you go. That's what I'm doing.
Well, I'm so proud of having you as a friend, Jonathan. You've taught me a lot. I've learned a lot from you. I enjoy the conversation. I enjoy the sense of humor and the way you tackle very, very difficult topics, but in a way that is so easy that you put them in a lovely little story, and not sweating the little things, because while we're talking about all these things, there are a lot of pushing problems, a lot of problems are on Earth, and I wish one day we can sort of wake up and try to raise up to the challenge, the real physical challenges that are about to face us, and there are a lot of them.
Yeah, this is true. Like, as we in our in our ivory towers are discussing these abstract ideas on the ground, there are very real challenges for humanity. So yeah, but no, thank you so much for the opportunity. Love our chats, mate. Is really great. And I hope the audience has got something out of this. Sometimes I'm a bit tongue-in-cheek and facetious, but you got to make it interesting. Otherwise, it's all dry and philosophical and boring.
Love it, Jonathan. Wouldn't have it any other way. So, folks, thank you so much. In a couple of days' time, I'll have another conversation with Derek, and I'm about to play the another intro. And here's Jonathan's book again. And the link, the Amazon link of the book, is in the description. Please check it out. And I think you should own a hard copy. Are you intending to have anything on Audible?
I'm so busy, but I would love to. Yeah, it's something. Ideally, yes, but it's just time.
Yeah, it can be, but it is powerful. And thank you very much, folks. I'm about to play another intro, and I would need your off-air your remarks, Jonathan, on the second intro that I want to use for my channel. Until then, thank you, folks. We'll see you later.